She thought she was just another waitress serving tables, but one unexpected moment changed her life forever. When a billionaire secretly watched her kindness toward a struggling child, he knew he had to step in. Emily Carter had never known a life of luxury. The worn-out sneakers she wore were a silent testament to the countless hours she spent on her feet, weaving between tables in the bustling downtown diner where she worked. The place had been her second home for years, a small but cozy restaurant filled with the hum of coffee machines and the chatter of regulars. Every day she arrived at dawn, tying her apron with practiced hands, pushing aside her exhaustion for the sake of a paycheck that barely covered her bills. But Emily wasn't one to complain. She had learned long ago that life didn't pause for those who struggled. It simply demanded that they keep moving. That afternoon, as she balanced a tray of steaming plates, her eyes landed on a boy sitting alone at a corner table. His clothes were slightly oversized, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and his hands clutched an empty glass as if debating whether to ask for a refill. Emily's heart clenched. She had seen hungry eyes before, but there was something about this child's silent struggle that made her pause. She didn't know it yet, but someone was watching. Seated near the large window, obscured behind a newspaper, was a man whose presence went unnoticed by most. Benjamin Hawthorne, a billionaire known for his sharp business acumen and a heart guarded by past regrets, observed the scene before him with quiet intrigue. He had not planned to be there. His chauffeur had suggested the diner when he mentioned craving something different from his usual high-end meetings and luxury dining experiences. As he sipped his black coffee, his attention drifted from the dull articles on corporate mergers to the young woman moving with effortless grace across the diner. She was different, not just efficient, but genuinely kind. He noticed the way her tired eyes softened when she saw the boy, how she instinctively refilled his glass with warm milk instead of water, and how she slipped an extra bread roll onto his plate without hesitation. She thought no one saw, but Benjamin did. And at that moment something stirred inside him. A memory, a feeling he had long buried. Little did Emily know, her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Emily continued her shift, unaware that her small act of kindness had caught someone's attention. The boy, no older than 8, hesitated before taking a careful sip of the warm milk. His eyes flickered with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation, as if kindness was something foreign to him. Emily knelt beside his table with a warm smile. "You can have as much as you need, sweetheart," she said gently. "Would you like something else?" The boy swallowed, his gaze shifting to the plate in front of him. I don't have any money," he whispered. Emily's chest ached at his words. "Don't worry about that," she reassured him. "Just eat, okay?" From his corner of the diner, Benjamin observed everything. He wasn't one to meddle in strangers' lives, but something about this woman, the way she cared without expecting anything in return, unraveled a part of him he had kept locked away. Memories of a past life surfaced, a time when he too had known the sting of hunger and the weight of an empty pocket. He folded his newspaper, setting it aside. This was not just another meal. This was a moment of fate, and Benjamin had a decision to make. As the boy ate, Emily returned to her other tables, greeting regulars with a practiced smile. She had spent years mastering the art of hiding her own struggles beneath a warm demeanor, but behind closed doors, life had been anything but easy. Bills piled up on her tiny apartment's kitchen counter, her mother's medical expenses drained every extra dollar, and no matter how hard she worked, financial stability remained just out of reach. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He had built an empire from nothing, clawing his way out of poverty with sheer determination. But along the way, he had forgotten what it meant to struggle, not in boardrooms or stock markets, but in real life. Watching Emily, he saw a resilience that reminded him of his younger self. The way she wiped down tables with unwavering determination, the way she comforted the boy as if he were her own. For the first time in years, Benjamin felt something more than just the weight of his wealth. He felt purpose. Pulling out his phone, he made a quiet call to his assistant. "I need to know everything about the waitress at table 6, he said. "Tonight." Fate had just set something extraordinary in motion. That evening, as the last customers trickled out of the diner and the neon sign flickered against the dim cityscape, Emily leaned against the counter, rubbing her sore wrists. The boy had finished his meal and left with a small smile, a quiet "thank you" lingering in the air. She had wanted to ask more, where he lived, if he had someone to take care of him, but the fear of prying too much held her back. Meanwhile, across town, Benjamin Hawthorne sat in the back seat of his sleek black sedan, scrolling through the report his assistant had compiled. Emily Carter, 27 years old, no college degree, 2 part-time jobs, and a mother battling chronic illness. Rent overdue, bank account nearly empty, and yet she still found it in her heart to help a stranger. Something inside Benjamin tightened. It was one thing to donate to charities from the comfort of his penthouse, but it was another to see true generosity in action, from someone who had little to give yet gave anyway. The next morning, Emily's routine began like any other. She tied her apron, greeted the usual customers, and prepared herself for another exhausting day. But as she cleared a table near the window, she noticed something unusual: an envelope placed neatly under a coffee cup. Frowning, she picked it up and glanced around. No one seemed to be watching. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the envelope. Inside was a single note written in elegant script: "Kindness never goes unnoticed. This is just the beginning." And beneath the note, 5 crisp $100 bills. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She scanned the diner, half expecting someone to step forward and claim it was a mistake. But no one did. The weight of the money in her hands sent a wave of confusion and disbelief crashing over her. Was this real? Who could have done this? She clutched the envelope to her chest, her mind racing. This kind of thing didn't happen to people like her. But this was only the beginning. For the rest of her shift, Emily couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in her stomach. The money was a gift, but from whom? And why? Was it just an act of generosity? Or was there something more? Meanwhile, across town, Benjamin stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the city below. He had spent years building wealth, investing in businesses, and signing million-dollar deals. But for the first time in a long time, something outside of his empire intrigued him. He had no intention of making himself known just yet. He wanted to see what she would do. Would she keep the money? Use it for herself? Or would her kindness extend even further? Emily, still stunned, stuffed the envelope into her coat pocket as she walked home that evening. Her tiny apartment felt colder than usual, the dim light barely illuminating the stacks of medical bills on the kitchen counter. She sat down, staring at the envelope as an internal war raged within her. Her mother's medicine, the overdue rent, the utilities, they all screamed for attention. But a part of her thought of the boy from the diner. How many other children were out there, just like him, struggling in silence? With a deep breath, she made a decision. The next day she returned to work early, stopping by the grocery store on the way. Instead of spending the money on herself, she used a portion of it to buy warm meals for the homeless individuals who often lingered near the alley behind the diner. She handed out sandwiches and bottles of water, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Benjamin, watching from the back seat of his car parked across the street, felt something shift inside him. She had no idea she was being watched, no clue that her actions were being silently observed. He had expected gratitude, maybe even hesitation. But what he hadn't expected was for her to give it away. And that was the moment he knew. He had to do more. Emily's small act of kindness set off a ripple effect she never could have anticipated. As the days passed, she continued using parts of the money to help those in need. Whether it was buying an extra cup of coffee for a shivering man outside the diner or leaving groceries at the doorstep of a struggling single mother, she didn't hesitate. But the lingering question still remained: who had left the envelope? Benjamin Hawthorne, always a man of strategy, wasn't ready to reveal himself just yet. He wanted to understand her more, to see what drove her. So, he continued to observe from the shadows, each day becoming more fascinated by her unwavering generosity despite her own struggles. One evening, Emily finished her shift and walked to the nearby pharmacy. Her mother's medication had run out, and she dreaded seeing the total on the register. As she placed the prescription on the counter, she clenched the remaining money in her pocket, calculating if she could afford both the medicine and groceries for the week. "Your total is $162, the cashier said. Emily swallowed hard. She had just enough left from the mysterious envelope, but using it meant she'd be back at zero. She hesitated, fingers gripping the bills tightly. Just then, a deep voice behind her broke the silence. "Put it on my tab." Emily turned sharply, her heart skipping a beat. Standing behind her was a tall, well-dressed man, Benjamin. His piercing blue eyes met hers, unreadable, yet warm. She shook her head immediately. "I can't let you do that." Benjamin gave a small, knowing smile. "Consider it a small repayment for what you did at the diner the other day." Her brows furrowed in confusion. You were there?" "I saw what you did for that little boy." He nodded toward the counter. "It's rare to see kindness without expectation these days." Emily felt her face heat up. It was just the right thing to do. "And that's exactly why I want to help," Benjamin said, handing his card to the cashier before she could protest. Emily stared at him, still trying to process what was happening. Who was this man? And why did he care? What she didn't know was that her life was about to take an unimaginable turn. Emily walked out of the pharmacy with Benjamin beside her, the crisp night air wrapping around them. She stole glances at him, still unsure what to make of his presence. "Why would a man like you be interested in what I do?" she asked finally. Benjamin smirked, hands in his coat pockets. "Because I see something in you, something I haven't seen in a long time." She frowned. "And what's that?" "Selflessness," he said simply. They stopped at the street corner, the city's lights flickering around them. Benjamin hesitated before speaking again. "Have dinner with me tomorrow night. I want to talk." Emily blinked in surprise. "Dinner? With you?" He chuckled. "I promise it's not what you think. I just have an idea, and I'd like to discuss it with you." Her instincts told her to say no. People like him didn't invite waitresses to dinner. But something in his eyes, something genuine, made her pause. After a moment, she sighed. "All right, one dinner." Benjamin nodded. "I'll send a car to pick you up at 7. As he walked away, Emily watched him disappear into the city, a strange feeling stirring in her chest. She had no idea that this dinner would change everything. The following evening, Emily stood in front of her tiny bedroom mirror, smoothing down the only decent dress she owned. It was simple, navy blue, and slightly worn at the edges, but it was the best she had. She had debated whether to go at all, uncertainty gnawing at her. Why would a billionaire want to talk to a waitress like her? At exactly 7 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up outside her apartment. The chauffeur, a polite older man, opened the door for her. As the car glided through the city streets, Emily's anxiety grew. This was completely out of her comfort zone. When they arrived at a high-end restaurant with crystal chandeliers and white-gloved waiters, she almost turned around. But Benjamin was already waiting for her inside. He stood as she approached, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'm glad you came," he said, pulling out a chair for her. She sat, her hands clasped together to hide her nervousness. "I still don't understand why I'm here." Benjamin leaned forward slightly. "Because I want to offer you something, an opportunity." Emily's brows knitted together. "An opportunity for what?" Benjamin paused for a moment before answering. To change your life. Her breath caught. The words felt too big, too impossible. I've been watching the way you give, even when you have so little, he continued. It's rare, and it made me realize something. I want to do more with my wealth than just make money. I want to help people like you, people who make a real difference. Emily shifted uncomfortably. I don't need charity. This isn't charity, Benjamin said firmly. This is a job offer. She blinked. A job? I want to start a foundation, he explained. Something that truly helps struggling families, single mothers, and children in need. And I need someone who understands that struggle firsthand, someone with heart. I need you. Emily's mind reeled. This wasn't just a dinner invitation. This was a life-altering proposal. Emily stared at Benjamin, unsure how to respond. Was this real? Could she trust this? You want me to run a foundation? She asked, disbelief in her voice. I want you to help build it from the ground up, he corrected. You don't need a fancy degree, just your compassion and understanding of what people really need. Emily swallowed hard. This was an impossible dream, the kind of thing that didn't happen to people like her. What if I fail? She whispered. Benjamin smiled. I don't think you will. But even if you do, isn't it worth trying? She thought of the boy at the diner, the strangers she had helped with what little she had. Maybe, just maybe, this was fate. After a long pause, she took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, I'll do it. Benjamin extended his hand. Then let's change some lives. As their hands met, Emily had no idea just how much her own life was about to change. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Emily. What had once been a life of routine and financial struggle suddenly shifted into something unrecognizable. She was introduced to an entirely new world, one of boardrooms, strategy meetings, and the kind of wealth she had only seen in magazines. At first she felt out of place, her worn-out shoes and second-hand clothes starkly contrasting the polished surroundings. But despite her initial hesitation, she refused to let doubt consume her. Benjamin had already begun laying the groundwork for the foundation, using his extensive resources to assemble a team. But Emily was more than just a figurehead. She was the heart of the project. Every decision she made was driven by first-hand experience. She knew what it felt like to go hungry, to struggle to afford basic necessities, to live in fear of losing everything. Her input became invaluable, and before long, her voice carried weight in rooms full of executives who had never faced hardship themselves. As the foundation took shape, so did Emily's confidence. Each day, she learned more about finance, about outreach programs, about the best ways to make real, lasting change. She visited shelters, spoke with struggling families, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the foundation would be built on more than just good intentions. It had to be practical, sustainable, and, most importantly, life-changing. But with success came opposition. Not everyone welcomed the idea of a billionaire diverting funds from high-profit investments into a charity. Business partners questioned Benjamin's motives, investors grew wary, and even members of his own board raised concerns about the shift in priorities. Rumors circulated, whispers of financial recklessness and mismanagement. Some claimed Emily was nothing more than a distraction, an inexperienced outsider with no place in their world. Emily felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had fought so hard to escape the struggles of her past, yet here she was, once again defending herself against people who doubted her worth. But she refused to back down. She had come too far to let fear dictate her future. And then the real blow came. A scandal emerged, one that threatened to undo everything. A leaked report suggested that the foundation was a cover-up for a financial scheme, that funds were being funneled into secret accounts rather than the programs they were meant to support. The accusations were baseless, but they spread like wildfire. News outlets seized the story, painting Emily as an opportunist who had manipulated her way into a position of power. The very people she had been trying to help began to question her integrity. Emily found herself at the center of a storm she had never anticipated. Strangers on the internet dissected her life, her past, even her mother's illness, as if she were nothing more than a public spectacle. The foundation's credibility wavered, and Benjamin faced mounting pressure to cut ties with her to protect his business reputation. The betrayal stung deeper than she could have imagined. She had poured everything into this cause, and now it was slipping away. The foundation, the opportunity to make real change, the faith she had begun to place in herself, it all hung in the balance. But just when it seemed like everything was about to crumble, something unexpected happened. The truth began to surface. As the scandal gained traction, Emily found herself standing at the edge of everything she had worked for, teetering between hope and despair. Every news outlet, every business analyst, every investor seemed to have an opinion about her, a woman who had risen from nothing and, in their eyes, had no place in the world of billionaires and power. The foundation's board members grew restless, some even pulling their support, unwilling to stake their reputations on a project now tainted by controversy. Benjamin, too, faced relentless scrutiny. His empire, built on decades of strategic decisions, now seemed vulnerable under the weight of relentless media coverage. Advisors urged him to sever ties with Emily, to distance himself from the storm she had unintentionally created. Some whispered that she had been a mistake, that trusting her had been a lapse in judgment that could cost him everything. Despite the mounting pressure, Emily refused to give in to despair. She had spent her entire life fighting for survival, and she wouldn't let lies dictate the course of her future. Instead of retreating into silence, she doubled down. She visited the communities the foundation had been working with, standing face to face with the very people they were trying to help. She refused to let the noise of the media drown out the truth. Then, something changed. The same people who had initially doubted her, the struggling families, the single parents, the children who had benefited from her efforts, they began to speak. One by one, testimonials flooded social media, videos of real people sharing their stories. They spoke of how the foundation had provided food, housing assistance, and educational support. They spoke of how Emily had been there, not just in an office, but on the ground, listening, helping, making a real difference. The tide began to shift. As the truth spread, investigative reporters began to uncover the origins of the scandal. It wasn't long before they traced the false accusations back to a group of business executives who had been opposed to Benjamin's shift toward philanthropy. They had orchestrated the rumors, leaking fabricated reports to manipulate public perception, all in an attempt to discredit Emily and pressure Benjamin into abandoning the foundation. The revelation sent shockwaves through the industry. Those who had been so quick to judge were now forced to confront their own role in the downfall of something meant to help the less fortunate. Some issued public apologies, while others scrambled to distance themselves from the very lies they had once supported. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt the weight begin to lift. She hadn't fought in vain. The foundation, once on the verge of collapse, was now receiving more support than ever. Donations poured in from people who had seen the truth, who believed in the mission. And Benjamin, who had never wavered in his faith in Emily, stood by her side, proving to the world that she wasn't just some passing inspiration. She was a force of change, and nothing could take that away from her. But even as the storm settled, one thing remained clear. Emily had learned that kindness, no matter how pure, would always be tested. And in the face of adversity, it was not wealth or power that determined success, but resilience. Despite the truth beginning to surface, the damage from the scandal was far from undone. Public perception was slow to change, and even as people began to question the validity of the accusations, Emily found herself drowning in self-doubt. The comments, the articles, the relentless speculation about her character had taken its toll. She had spent her entire life believing that if she worked hard enough, if she gave enough, if she did the right thing, she could carve out a better future. But now, for the first time, She questioned whether the world would ever allow someone like her to rise without tearing her down. The foundation's offices, once filled with hope and purpose, were now eerily quiet. Some employees had resigned, fearing that continued association with Emily would damage their own careers. Funding had been put on hold by hesitant donors, and ongoing projects had slowed to a near halt. Emily sat alone in the dimly lit office, staring at stacks of paperwork that had once excited her. Now they felt like evidence of failure. The accusations, though proven false, had left an ugly scar. Would people ever trust the foundation again? Would they ever trust her? Then, a knock at the door. She turned, startled, to find a woman standing there, someone she recognized instantly. It was the mother of the young boy from the diner, the child she had fed without a second thought all those weeks ago. In the woman's hands was an envelope, trembling slightly as she extended it toward Emily. Inside were a handful of small bills and a note, scrawled in uneven handwriting. "You helped us when no one else would. Now it's our turn to help you." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she realized what was happening. This woman who had so little had gathered what she could to try and give back. And she wasn't alone. More people began arriving. Families she had assisted, children who had received meals, elderly individuals who had been given warmth and care. They weren't there to ask for help, they were there to stand with her. Word of the growing support spread quickly. Videos of the people who had benefited from Emily's efforts began circulating, sparking a movement far larger than she could have imagined. The voices of those who had been ignored for too long were now louder than any headline, stronger than any accusation. News stations began covering the outpouring of support, shifting the narrative from scandal to resilience. Social media erupted with messages of encouragement, and soon it wasn't just local communities defending Emily. It was people from all walks of life, sharing their own stories of struggle and perseverance. Benjamin watched as the tide turned, his respect for Emily growing deeper with every passing day. He had seen powerful men fight to defend their fortunes, but never had he seen someone fight so hard simply to do the right thing. Yet, even as public sentiment shifted, there were still those who wanted to see her fail. The business elites who had orchestrated the scandal weren't willing to accept defeat so easily. They doubled down, pushing legal challenges, attempting to discredit the newfound support as nothing more than emotional manipulation. But Emily had learned something important. Resilience wasn't just about enduring hardship. It was about standing back up again and again, no matter how many times the world tried to push her down. So, she fought back. Instead of retreating, she took the stage at a press conference, standing in front of the cameras, not as a victim, but as a leader. She spoke not of the lies, not of the betrayal, but of the people who had been forgotten. She reminded the world that this was never about her. It was about them. And for the first time, the world listened. The impact of Emily's words was immediate. Major publications that had once condemned her were now running retractions, acknowledging the lack of evidence behind the accusations. Investors who had hesitated were now calling, eager to reinstate their support. But more importantly, something deeper had changed. The foundation wasn't just about charity anymore. It had become a movement. People across the country began forming their own initiatives, inspired by Emily's determination. Grassroots organizations sprung up, mirroring the very work she had fought so hard for. And at the center of it all, Emily stood stronger than ever. Benjamin, watching from the sidelines, felt something unfamiliar stir within him. He had spent his life believing that money was the greatest power in the world. But Emily had proven him wrong. True power came from something far greater: conviction, integrity, and the courage to keep going when everything seemed lost. The business elites who had tried to destroy her reputation found themselves facing consequences of their own. Investigations were launched into their practices, exposing unethical dealings and hidden corruption. The very people who had sought to bury Emily were now struggling to keep their own names clean, and as their influence crumbled, Emily's only grew. She had not just survived. She had won. Months later, as the chaos settled and the foundation flourished once more, Emily stood at the edge of the city, looking out over the skyline that had once seemed so far out of reach. The struggles of her past would always be a part of her, but they no longer defined her. The foundation was no longer just an idea. It was a force of change, reaching further than she ever imagined. Families were being lifted out of poverty. Children were receiving education, and communities once forgotten were thriving. But the most unexpected change had been within herself. She had once believed that wealth was a barrier, something that separated people like her from people like Benjamin. But she had learned that wealth was simply a tool, one that, when placed in the right hands, could build rather than destroy. And Benjamin, he had changed too. The cold businessman who had once observed from a distance was now fully immersed in the Foundation's mission. He had stepped out of the shadows, using his influence to amplify the voices that had been silenced for too long. Emily knew now that this was where she was meant to be. She had fought, she had struggled, and she had endured. But most importantly, she had proven that kindness, even in the darkest of moments, would always find a way to shine through. With the scandal behind her and the Foundation stronger than ever, Emily finally had the chance to breathe. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was living with purpose. The Foundation had grown beyond anything she had imagined, with new programs reaching families in need, job placement initiatives giving struggling individuals a second chance, and scholarships opening doors for children who once had none. Despite the newfound stability, Emily still found herself returning to the diner where it all began. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and the comforting hum of conversation reminded her of the woman she used to be. The one who had worked tirelessly just to make ends meet. She wasn't ashamed of that version of herself. In many ways, she was still the same person. One afternoon, as she stepped inside, the familiar chime of the doorbell rang. The same old regulars were there, nodding in recognition, but this time, something was different. The waitress behind the counter, the woman who had taken over her old position, looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. Emily realized then how much had changed. She was no longer the struggling waitress worrying about how she would make rent, but she would never forget where she came from. At a corner table, a young boy sat with his mother, the same boy she had helped all those months ago. He looked healthier now, happier. His mother smiled at Emily, gratitude shining in her eyes. No words were exchanged, but none were needed. The impact had been made. Emily had always believed that life was a cycle, that kindness had a way of coming back in unexpected ways, and standing in that diner, she saw proof of it. Back at the Foundation's headquarters, a celebration was underway. The official launch of their new housing initiative was in motion, a program designed to provide stable homes for struggling families. It was one of the biggest projects yet, and Emily had poured every ounce of effort into making it a reality. As she moved through the event, greeting guests and partners, she caught sight of Benjamin standing by the large floor-to-ceiling windows, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. He had changed too. The man who had once been defined by boardroom negotiations and corporate strategies now stood as someone deeply invested in something far greater than wealth. The two shared an unspoken understanding. This journey had transformed them both. Reporters and photographers swarmed, eager to capture the moment, but Emily barely noticed. This wasn't about publicity or recognition. It was about real change, about the lives being rebuilt because of the work they had done. That night, as the event wound down, Emily stood on the rooftop of the Foundation's headquarters looking out at the city lights. A soft breeze carried the distant hum of life below, a reminder that the world never stopped moving. She had come so far, but this was only the beginning. You're absolutely right. I will expand the falling action to reach the full 3,000 words, adding more depth to Emily's transformation, the Foundation's impact, and the emotional resolution of her journey. Here are the additional 4 chunks of the falling action, each 500 words long. In the days that followed the launch event, Emily found herself reflecting on everything that had led her to this point. The weight of struggle, the uncertainty, and the pain of being doubted had shaped her, but they no longer defined her. Every morning, she arrived at the Foundation's office early, reviewing plans for new projects. Her inbox was filled with messages, letters from families who had been helped, requests from communities seeking aid, and unexpected support from individuals who had been moved by her story. One message in particular caught her attention. It was from a young woman named Carla, a single mother who had recently lost her job. In her email, she described how she had watched Emily's story unfold on the news, how she had seen herself in Emily's struggles, and how for the first time in years she believed that someone truly understood. Emily set the email aside for a moment, blinking away unexpected tears. She had spent so long believing that no one saw people like her, women who worked tirelessly but still barely scraped by. But now she was proof that those struggles mattered, that they deserved attention, and most importantly, that they could be overcome. With renewed determination, Emily called a meeting with her team. They weren't just going to expand the Foundation's work, they were going to create an entire network of resources for struggling workers, making sure that no one had to fight the same battles she once did. Her past had not been erased, but it had been given meaning. As the Foundation grew, so did Emily's responsibilities. The work was rewarding, but exhausting, and for the first time she understood the immense pressure that came with leadership. She was no longer just a waitress surviving paycheck to paycheck. She was now in charge of a movement, one that thousands of people depended on. Despite the weight of it all, she refused to let fear consume her. Every decision she made, she reminded herself of the people she was doing it for. Meanwhile, Benjamin had shifted from being an observer to an active participant. He attended meetings with city officials, worked behind the scenes to secure funding, and more than once sat beside Emily in late-night strategy sessions as they discussed the Foundation's future. The two of them had formed an unbreakable partnership, not based on wealth or power, but on a shared vision of what was possible. Yet, even with everything they had accomplished, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had spent so much time focusing on the Foundation, on proving herself, that she hadn't stopped to ask what she truly wanted. And as she watched the city lights flicker from her office window, she realized she had spent years fighting for everyone else. Maybe it was time to fight for herself, too. One evening, after a particularly long day, Emily found herself back at her mother's apartment. The familiar scent of home-cooked meals greeted her, a stark contrast to the luxury events and boardrooms she had grown accustomed to. Her mother, still frail but healthier now thanks to the Foundation's support, welcomed her with a warm smile. They sat together at the small kitchen table, the same one where Emily had once sorted overdue bills and counted spare change just to afford groceries. As they ate, her mother listened quietly while Emily spoke about the Foundation's success, the plans for expansion, and the new programs they were launching. But as the conversation wound down, her mother reached across the table and took her hand. She reminded Emily that success wasn't just about changing the world. It was also about finding joy in her own life. For years, Emily had been so focused on survival that she had never allowed herself to dream beyond it. That night, as she walked home, her mother's words lingered in her mind. For the first time, she wondered what her own future looked like beyond the Foundation. She had built something incredible, but what came next? Emily decided to take a rare day off, her first in months. Instead of rushing to meetings or reviewing reports, she spent the morning walking through the neighborhood where she had once struggled to make ends meet. The streets felt different now. The weight of financial insecurity no longer pressed on her shoulders, but she would never forget what it felt like. As she passed by the old diner, she hesitated before stepping inside. The place hadn't changed much, the air still filled with the scent of fresh coffee and warm bread. The same owner greeted her with a knowing smile, offering her a seat at the counter. Sitting there, she realized how much her life had transformed. The woman who had once worried about rent, who had hidden exhaustion behind a practiced smile, was no longer the same. But she also knew she couldn't let go of the person she used to be. That version of her, the one who had struggled, who had fought, who had endured, was the reason she had become the woman she was today. As she sipped her coffee, she made a silent promise to herself. No matter how much success she achieved, no matter how far she went, she would never forget the waitress who had once given away a meal to a hungry child. Because that moment, that simple act of kindness, had been the start of everything. Months had passed since the scandal had faded, and in its place something stronger had emerged. The foundation was no longer just a charitable effort, it had become a movement that stretched far beyond what Emily had ever imagined. New initiatives were launched, expanding into neighboring cities, bringing aid to families who had spent years slipping through the cracks. Emily had once feared she wasn't ready for this kind of responsibility, but now she embraced it with confidence. She had transformed from a woman who barely had enough to survive into someone who had the power to change lives. And yet, as she sat in her office, reviewing proposals for the foundation's next phase, she couldn't shake the feeling that something within her was still unsettled. The past had shaped her, and the future looked bright, but she hadn't stopped to ask what truly made her happy. She had given everything to the foundation, to the people who needed her. But what about the parts of herself she had neglected along the way? That evening, as the city lights twinkled outside her office window, she made a quiet decision. It was time to stop running from herself. One of the foundation's newest projects was a mentorship program for young adults from struggling backgrounds, people who, like Emily, had been dealt difficult hands but refused to let their circumstances define them. She spent time speaking with them, listening to their stories and sharing her own. It was during one of these mentorship meetings that she met a young woman named Ava, whose story struck a deep chord within her. Ava had aged out of the foster system and had spent years drifting from job to job, never quite feeling like she belonged anywhere. When she spoke, Emily saw a reflection of her younger self, the uncertainty, the fear of failure, the belief that the world wasn't built for people like her to succeed. That night, as Emily walked home, she realized just how much she had changed. If someone had told her years ago that she would be in a position to guide and uplift others, she wouldn't have believed them. But now she saw clearly that she wasn't just changing the lives of those in need. She was rewriting the narrative for people like her, showing them that the cycle of struggle didn't have to define them forever. The realization settled in her chest like a steady flame. Her purpose had never just been about survival. It had been about proving that resilience, kindness, and determination could break even the strongest chains. One evening, as Emily left the foundation's headquarters, she found Benjamin waiting outside, leaning against his car with a thoughtful expression. Over the past year, he had become more than just the man who had changed her life. He had become someone she trusted, someone who had walked this journey with her. Without saying a word, he handed her an envelope. Inside was a single document, one that transferred full ownership of the foundation to her. No investors, no hidden clauses, no conditions, just a signature line with her name. Emily's breath caught as she looked up at him. For so long she had questioned whether she truly belonged in this world, whether she deserved to lead something so important. But this was proof that she had earned it. Benjamin had always been a man of wealth and strategy. But in this moment, Emily saw something deeper, an understanding that true power wasn't about control. It was about knowing when to step aside and trust someone else to lead. Tears stung her eyes as she gripped the document tightly. This wasn't just a foundation anymore. It was her legacy. Months later, Emily stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, addressing an audience filled with community leaders, business executives, and the very people whose lives had been transformed by the foundation. She had been invited to speak about resilience, about overcoming hardship, and about what it meant to create real change. As she spoke, she didn't talk about money, business deals, or success in the traditional sense. She talked about the boy at the diner, the moment that had changed everything, and the lesson she had carried with her ever since. That kindness, no matter how small, had the power to ripple out in ways no one could ever predict. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her. It was for every single person who had fought, who had endured, and who had believed that a better future was possible. After the event, as she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she found herself standing at the edge of the city, looking out at the skyline. For the first time in her life, she felt completely at peace. She had spent years fighting for stability, for survival, for purpose, and now she had all of it. But more than that, she had finally found herself. Because in the end, her journey hadn't just been about changing the world. It had been about proving that she belonged in it,